Welcome back to our channel. Today's story is one of courage, destiny, and a moment that changed hundreds of lives in the sky. The morning sun rose softly over the city as passengers arrived one by one at the airport, each carrying their own story, their own purpose, their own quiet hopes for the journey ahead. Among them was Amina, a young woman in her mid-20s who blended effortlessly into the crowd. Nothing about her appearance suggested something unusual. She looked like any other traveler, calm, well-composed, and seemingly focused on reaching her destination. No one knew she had spent years hiding a skill that had once defined her life. She walked through the terminal with a natural confidence, but her eyes silently scanned everything, an instinct she never fully lost. Years ago, during her teenage years, she had received extensive gliding and small aircraft, training under a scholarship program that encouraged young women to explore aviation. She had excelled beyond expectations, demonstrating a talent for understanding machines, aerodynamics, and emergency handling. But life had taken her down a different path, far away from aviation. Her training had become a buried memory, a chapter closed long ago. Today, she was simply a passenger heading home for the first time in months. As she approached her gate, she noticed families excited for vacation, business travelers typing rapidly on laptops, and a group of teenagers taking pictures of the aircraft resting outside the window. It was a twin-engine commercial jet, gleaming under the sunlight with the quiet promise of safety and reliability. Crew members moved with practiced precision, pilots reviewing checklists, flight attendants greeting passengers with warm professionalism. Everything appeared routine and structured. Amina boarded the aircraft and found her seat near the middle. She placed her small backpack beneath the seat in front of her and settled in, taking a moment to appreciate the familiar hum of the cabin systems powering up. Her eyes drifted outside where the runway stretched endlessly, a path guiding hundreds of lives through the sky every day. She felt at peace. As boarding continued, she observed the passengers around her, a mother comforting her young daughter afraid of flying, an elderly man whispering a prayer under his breath, two friends laughing over stories of their last adventure. The cabin was filled with a comfortable sense of normalcy. The pilots announced final preparations, and soon the engines roared to life, shaking the fuselage gently as the aircraft taxied to the runway. Amina's past quietly resurfaced, not in memories but in instinctive awareness. She recognized the change in engine pitch, the slight adjustments in thrust, and the careful maneuver the pilots performed as the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline. When the takeoff roll began, she felt the acceleration deep in her chest. The passengers around her were excited, some nervous, but she understood every motion unfolding beneath them. The aircraft lifted from the ground gracefully, climbing through the morning haze. City buildings shrunk beneath the clouds, and sunlight poured through the windows, painting the cabin in warm gold. The ascent was smooth. The passengers relaxed. Seatbelts loosened. A child pressed her face against the window in awe. Everything felt beautifully normal. But at 20,000 feet, Amina sensed the first hint that something was off. It was subtle, so subtle that others would have mistaken it for turbulence or wind shear. A slight vibration from the left side of the aircraft, inconsistent, irregular, almost like a hesitant cough from the engine. The passengers barely noticed, but Amina's experience registered it instantly. Her heartbeat steadied, her senses sharpened, and her mind switched to analytical mode. She glanced toward the wing, watching the engine's steady rotation. It appeared stable, yet the faint vibration persisted. The seatbelt sign switched on earlier than usual, surprising some passengers. A flight attendant calmly walked through the aisle, checking latches, ensuring everything remained secure. The professionalism was reassuring, but Amina felt pressure building in her chest, an instinct she never ignored during training. The aircraft continued climbing. The vibration intensified slightly. Amina knew engines rarely failed without warning. There were signs, small, nearly invisible deviations that only a trained observer could detect. She closed her eyes momentarily and breathed slowly, grounding herself. Then came the first loud metallic bang, sharp, violent, unmistakable. The cabin jolted. Passengers gasped in fear. Some grabbed armrests, others froze completely. The aircraft shook as the left engine sputtered. flames briefly flaring from within before vanishing into smoke. The atmosphere shifted instantly from calm to panic. A sudden loss of thrust pulled the aircraft sideways, forcing the pilots to counteract aggressively. The engine shrieked with grinding metallic noise, then fell completely silent. The cabin lights flickered. Panic rippled across the passengers. A mother clutched her crying daughter. An elderly man gripped his seat and prayed louder. The entire aircraft felt heavier, slower, vulnerable. Amina's body reacted before her mind even processed the events fully. Years of training lit up inside her like a forgotten fire. She studied the wing, the airflow disruption, the engine casing damage, the behavior of the aircraft as it struggled to stabilize. With only one functioning engine, she knew enough to understand the pilots were fighting a rapidly deteriorating situation. Even though she had not flown in years, everything inside her urged her to stay alert, to analyze, to prepare. She pulled her seatbelt tighter and mentally reviewed emergency procedures she hoped she would never again need. She looked at the terrified faces around her and felt a responsibility rising within her, a responsibility she had not anticipated, yet could not ignore. The aircraft continued to lose altitude. The cabin trembled. Alarms sounded faintly from the cockpit. And while everyone else felt helpless, Amina felt something entirely different, an awakening. Her past, once forgotten, had returned at the exact moment it was needed most. The aircraft shook violently as it continued its uneven descent, the single remaining engine straining to keep the jet level. Amina kept her breathing steady while listening to the subtle changes in engine tone and airflow. She sensed the aircraft slipping into a dangerous imbalance that could worsen with any sudden movement. The left engine's complete failure meant the pilots were managing asymmetric thrust, one of the most challenging scenarios during flight. Through the cabin window, she could see the damaged engine housing vibrating dangerously. A faint trail of smoke trailed behind it, gradually thinning as the aircraft cut through layers of cold air. The sky outside remained deceptively calm. Inside, however, tension rose like a slow, suffocating fog. Passengers gripped their seats. Some cried quietly. Others trembled in shock. A flight attendant struggled to maintain composure while instructing people to stay buckled. Her voice remained steady, but her hands shook as she checked the overhead bins to ensure nothing would fall during turbulence. A sudden drop pulled everyone forward as the nose dipped sharply. Gasps erupted across the cabin. Coffee spilled across trays. Amina braced herself against the seat in front of her as gravity shifted abruptly. The aircraft stabilized again, but the sensation of falling left the passengers pale and terrified. The pilots attempted to control the rate of descent, but the damaged engine created unpredictable yaw. Amina analyzed every motion. Her training reminded her that losing one engine at altitude was survivable, but the violent bang earlier indicated possible engine disintegration, something far more catastrophic than a simple flameout. If debris had struck the wing or fuel lines, the situation could rapidly escalate into a structural emergency. The remaining engine roared louder, pushing itself to compensate. Amina felt the aircraft subtly banking left, then right, as the pilots tried to keep it balanced. The flight crew's professionalism showed. They fought to keep control. But the jet was heavy, wounded, and losing altitude faster than ideal. Inside the cabin, fear turned into quiet chaos. A man fainted from shock. A flight attendant rushed to assist him while trying to maintain order. A family huddled together, trembling with every vibration. Amina kept observing, assessing, calculating. The pilots would need assistance if the situation continued to worsen, especially if communication or control systems became compromised. She noticed the cabin lights flickering again. That was unusual and worrying. Electrical instability could affect navigation, hydraulic systems, or even cockpit instrumentation. The smell of burnt wiring drifted faintly through the air vents. That smell meant heat somewhere it shouldn't be. The aircraft dropped another 100 feet in a sudden dip, sending overhead compartments rattling. Passengers screamed. Loose items slid across the floor. Amina held on to her seat and steadied herself, her mind rapidly recalling emergency training procedures she hadn't practiced in years. Her instincts remained sharp, but she knew stepping in without permission could disrupt the crew's authority. She needed to wait, wait for the moment when her help would be necessary. Undeniable and life-saving. Through the window, the ground slowly came into view between clouds, patches of forest, distant roads, and small clusters of buildings. The descent was too fast. The aircraft wasn't following a controlled glide path. It was being forced down by a combination of drag, imbalance, and possibly leaking fuel that reduced efficiency. A loud alarm sounded from the cockpit, muffled but terrifying. Amina recognized that alarm immediately from her training. It indicated dangerously low airspeed relative to the aircraft's weight. A stall at this altitude would be catastrophic. The nose pitched down slightly to regain airspeed. Passengers screamed again, but Amina knew it was the correct maneuver. The pilots were trying to prevent an aerodynamic stall, but the damaged engine and potential structural issues made every correction risky. The cabin crew hurried up and down the aisles, checking for injuries and securing loose objects. Their professionalism was admirable. But Amina noticed something alarming. The lead flight attendant whispered urgently into the intercom with a look of dread she couldn't hide. Something worse was happening behind the scenes. A sudden metallic clang echoed across the fuselage. The aircraft lurched violently. Amina gripped her seat as the wing dipped sharply left. The passengers panicked. Someone screamed for help. Amina felt the aircraft struggling to compensate. The uneven forces were becoming too difficult to control. If the pilots lost even a fraction of control authority, the jet could enter a spin or roll that would be impossible to recover from. Amina's heart pounded, not from fear, but from calculation. She knew the physics. She knew the risks. She also knew what needed to happen if the situation continued to deteriorate. The pilots needed help from someone who understood. Emergency gliding principles from inside. The cabin if cockpit access became necessary. For now, she waited, watching the terrain grow clearer beneath the thinning clouds. The aircraft was dropping faster than standard operating procedures allowed. The remaining engine rattled with overuse. The smell of burning intensified. The cabin pressure fluctuated slightly, causing ears to pop painfully. Amina's instincts told her something crucial. The pilots were losing systems faster than they could manage. And if the jet continued descending at this unstable rate, they wouldn't reach the nearest airport in time. Her fingers twitched. Her training throbbed inside her like a rising tide. She knew she couldn't stay seated much longer. The survival of everyone on board might soon depend on her stepping forward, something she had never imagined happening again. The aircraft trembled. The alarms continued. The descent steepened, and Amina understood what was coming next. She would be needed, more than ever, as the aircraft sank lower, descending through turbulent layers of wind. The situation worsened with every passing second. The cockpit alarms grew more frequent, echoing through the structure of the jet like muffled sirens of desperation. Amina felt the nose dip harder than before, and the sudden fall startled even those who had been bracing for the worst. The aircraft was no longer just struggling, it was fighting for survival. The cabin lights flickered again, shorter this time, but enough to raise concern. Amina scanned the reactions of the passengers and the crew. The lead flight attendant moved down the aisle quickly, her face pale yet composed as she reassured passengers with gestures. But the tension in her movements revealed everything she knew. The pilots were nearing the limits of what they could control. A slight popping sound came from the left wing, followed by a brief shudder that rippled along the fuselage. Amina's heart tightened. This vibration was different from before, stronger, more mechanical, like something loose had shifted out of alignment. From her perspective, it could be structural stress or loose debris rattling inside the damaged engine. Both scenarios were disastrous. The smell of burning intensified. Amina leaned closer to the air vent and inhaled cautiously. It wasn't fuel, it was electrical. Somewhere in the aircraft, circuits were overheating. Electrical failures. In a twin-engine aircraft under emergency power could cascade into major system loss, including navigation, hydraulics, or even cockpit instrumentation. The aircraft jolted again, banking right this time in a sharp, uncontrolled motion. Passengers screamed. A tray flew across the aisle. Someone shouted for help. The turbulence wasn't natural. This was the result of uneven thrust meeting heavy drag. Amina finally unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood carefully, gripping the seatbacks as she navigated toward the flight attendants who were struggling to keep passengers calm. The aircraft lurched, almost throwing her off balance, but she steadied herself. Her training guided her steps controlled, accurate, aware of how the floor tilt shifted beneath her feet. The lead flight attendant looked at her with confusion and worry. Amina leaned closer and calmly revealed who she was, not in words, but in a gesture that showed her pilot-level knowledge. The attendant's eyes widened slightly, surprise mixing with hope. Without breaking composure, the attendant guided Amina toward the front of the aircraft. Amina's heart pulsed steadily. She didn't want to interfere, but she sensed the pilots needed assistance, maybe not to fly, but to coordinate, to assess cabin conditions, to relay technical observations only another trained person could understand. As she approached the cockpit door, the aircraft abruptly tilted again. She steadied herself by gripping a handrail. The engines groaned in protest. The airframe vibrated more violently than before. The descent rate increased, slightly as the remaining engine fought to maintain. Altitude, the lead attendant, knocked on the cockpit door. After a tense pause, the door opened just enough to allow communication. Amina caught a glimpse of flashing warning lights. Inside, the instrument, panels filled with red and amber. Indicators. The pilots looked exhausted, their hands moving rapidly over the controls as they fought to stabilize the aircraft. The captain strained. Expression made it clear. They were overwhelmed, the attendant whispered, something urgently. Glancing back at Amina, the cockpit door opened a bit wider. Amina stepped inside enough to observe without obstructing. Her eyes scanned the displays. Airspeed fluctuated near stall speed. The left engine's readouts were dead. Hydraulic pressure in one system was dropping. And most concerning, the flap controls were unreliable, which meant landing would be dangerously fast and unstable. Amina pointed out the asymmetric thrust pattern she had noticed, from the cabin and the smoke behavior, from the failed engine. Her calm, precise observations helped the pilots confirm what they feared. Fuel lines on the left wing were compromised, and additional systems could fail at any moment. The first officer relayed the risks. The captain nodded grimly. They needed to prepare for an emergency landing, but the nearest airport was barely within gliding distance. With the remaining engine overworked and hydraulics uncertain, every minute mattered. The captain instructed Amina to return to the cabin and assist the crew with brace preparation and situational awareness. Her training could help manage panic and prevent injuries during high-impact landing scenarios. She understood immediately. Returning to the cabin, she moved with purpose. The passengers stared at her with frightened curiosity. She projected calmness, helping the crew maintain control. She demonstrated proper brace positions to those struggling to understand. She ensured seatbelts were secure and loose items removed. The aircraft shook harder. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the structure as the pilot deployed partial flaps, limited due to hydraulic damage. The change caused a sudden lurch that sent a wave of gasps through the cabin. Clouds thinned, revealing clearer views of terrain, fields, open land, and a stretch of emergency-use airstrip miles ahead. The aircraft was descending rapidly, but it might just reach the strip if the engine survived long enough. A warning chime rang across the cabin. Amina immediately recognized it, overheating in the remaining engine. Her pulse quickened. If the second engine failed, the aircraft would lose thrust completely and be forced into a full glide, something commercial pilots trained for but rarely executed under such duress. She steadied herself, placing a hand on the seatback of a terrified elderly passenger. She ensured everyone near her understood how to brace properly. She signaled to the flight attendants to secure themselves. The aircraft roared as the final descent began. Trees rushed upward through the windows. The ground approached too quickly. Amina's instincts screamed one thing clearly. This would not be a normal landing, but she would be ready. The aircraft trembled violently as the final stretch of descent began. The emergency strip lay ahead like a thin gray lifeline carved into the earth. Its short length and narrow width made it unsuitable for large jets, but it was the only reachable landing zone. The pilots aligned the aircraft with utmost precision, but the imbalance created by the dead engine made alignment unstable and unpredictable. Amina braced herself along with the passengers, but her mind remained acutely alert. She tracked the slight drift of the aircraft from center line, recognizing the Pilots were struggling against strong crosswinds blowing unpredictably. Across the open landscape, with damaged hydraulics and asymmetric thrust, the aircraft fought against forces it was never designed to endure. The remaining engine rattled violently as it pushed itself beyond safe limits. Warning lights inside the cockpit illuminated again. Even from the cabin, Amina heard the change in vibration, a sign the engine was beginning to overheat dangerously. She closed her eyes momentarily, preparing herself for the possibility that the engine would fail entirely before touchdown. The wheels extended, though not smoothly. A sudden thud indicated partial deployment. Amina felt the drop in altitude quicken, briefly as the increased drag pulled the aircraft downward. The passengers clutched their armrests and braced in fear. The cabin crew took their final positions and signaled readiness. A gust of wind pushed the aircraft sideways. The wings tilted. Loose items rattled violently. Amina's heart pounded. But she knew the pilots were performing an incredibly difficult maneuver, holding a slipping aircraft, steady while descending at an angle to compensate for wind and asymmetric thrust. At the last moment, the pilots corrected their angle. The runway aligned directly beneath them. The engine screamed under maximum power, fighting to keep the nose level. The ground raced upward. Grass blurred past the windows. The wheels hit the runway with brutal force. The entire cabin lurched forward as passengers screamed in shock. The left landing gear strained under the imbalance, threatening collapse. The right gear slammed down moments later. The aircraft bounced, momentarily airborne again, dangerous, unstable, and unpredictable. On the second impact, the fuselage rattled with violent intensity. The pilots deployed emergency braking, but with compromised hydraulics, braking pressure fluctuated dangerously. The aircraft skidded sideways, tires screaming against the pavement. Amina immediately saw the danger. The aircraft was drifting off the runway toward the uneven grass field. If the landing gear struck a ditch or soft patch, the jet could flip. She shouted instructions to the nearest passengers through urgent gestures, keeping their bodies in safe positions. She pointed rapidly to alert the flight attendants who followed her cues. The aircraft continued sliding, the nose dipping dangerously as the pilots fought for control. Dirt and grass sprayed across the windows. Amina braced herself harder. Her chest tightened. The slide felt endless. Then finally the aircraft slowed. The violent motion eased. The sound of skidding faded into silence. The cabin shook one last time as the nose gear settled. And then stillness. A stunned silence filled the aircraft. Passengers slowly lifted their heads, tears streaming down many faces. They couldn't process what had just happened. But they knew one thing. They were alive. But it wasn't over yet. Amina smelled something sharp and alarming, fuel vapors. The damaged engine, still smoking, posed a fire risk. The aircraft needed to be evacuated immediately. The flight attendants opened the emergency doors. Slides deployed. Panic surged, but Amina stepped forward again, guiding passengers toward the exits with calm urgency. She helped a mother with her child exit safely. She supported the elderly man whose hands still trembled uncontrollably. She assisted passengers who struggled to move quickly, ensuring no one was left behind. Smoke rose from the left engine. The pilots urged everyone to move far from the aircraft. Amina stayed until the very last group exited. She scanned the cabin, making sure no frightened passenger had frozen in place. Only after confirming every seat was empty did she run toward the slide and exit. On the ground, passengers gathered in small groups, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Some collapsed to their knees. Others hugged strangers. The flight attendants looked at Amina with deep gratitude, their expressions acknowledging how crucial her presence had been. The pilots approached her. Their exhausted, relieved faces said everything. They understood fully what she had done, what her calm observations and actions had prevented. Emergency vehicles raced across the field. Passengers were escorted away from the smoking aircraft. The crisis slowly dissolved into safety. Amina stood quietly, watching the damaged jet that had carried them through a battle of physics, wind, and fate. She felt no pride, only gratitude that her long-forgotten training had resurfaced. At the exact moment it was needed, passengers looked at her with awe, whispering about the mysterious young woman who had stepped up when hope seemed lost. Some called her a hero. Others prayed blessings upon her. She simply nodded politely and stepped aside. As the sun set behind the horizon, painting the sky in soft orange light, Amina realized something profound. She had not truly left aviation. It had remained part of her all along, waiting quietly until the world needed her again. She had boarded the aircraft as just another passenger, but she walked away as the reason they survived. A true Hopetales ending?